Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I'm the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich. Hello, Gerald.
Hi, Linda. Good to see you again. Good to talk with you.
Gerald is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Critical Thinking, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. Today is April the 17th, 2022. We are focused in this series on the analysis of reasoning going deeper. And in this particular series, we're focused on information. So the role of information and reasoning. And today, in this particular session, we're going to focus on three concepts that help us organize information, if you will. And so I'm just going to name them. I'm going to say a little bit about them, and then we're going to start exploring them and coming up with some examples of each one. So the first one, or they don't come in any order, but one is inert information. So one type of information that we have in our minds is an inert information. It's information we're carrying around, but that is not doing us really any good, so to speak. We're not acting upon it in any way. So that's one type, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Then we have activated ignorance, another type of information. So activated ignorance means that we are acting upon information that is inaccurate. But of course, we believe it is accurate. So we're acting upon this information. Then we have activated knowledge. And this is what we want to achieve. And this is what critical thinking helps us achieve. Activated knowledge means that we are acting upon information that is accurate. And not only that is accurate, but is also very useful in context. So the activated knowledge gives us power in a situation, so to speak. So let's go back then to inert information, and then we're going to burrow in briefly to each one of these, and again see if we can come up with some examples. So let's talk about then inert information, which is again information we're just carrying around in our heads that we're not using. Gerald, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, I can give a few examples. There's this thing that happens in elementary, middle, and high school, and that to a lot of people, and that many teachers are teaching you stuff that they kind of justify by saying, oh, later on in your life, you're going to see how valuable it was to learn trigonometry or algebra or how to diagram sentences, and many times it's not true that those will help you. I often ask teachers at workshop or higher education instructors at workshops, okay, so those of you who are not in a math related field, how many of you could understand what a quadratic equation is? And virtually no one raises their hand, right? And so I can say, well, if I asked you now, when would you use a quadratic equation? There's absolutely no hand going up. And I say, even if you can give the formula for a quadratic equation, you can write out what the equation means, it still doesn't help you. You don't have any idea what to do with it. And yet, algebra teachers and trigonometry teachers, maybe with some truth in it, say this is very helpful. It gives you a quantitative sense of the world and helps you reason through mathematical problems. And there may be truth in that, but my feeling is that it's a very far removed truth. I don't want to be picking on math here because it goes all the way through many fields. I can say, here's something I learned. I'm embarrassed to say it. In elementary school or middle school, I learned the prepositions. So I'm going to tell you the prepositions now. About, above, across, after, against, among, around, at, before, beside, between, by, down, during, except for, from, into, of, off, on, over, through, to, toward, cover up with. Now, now I want you to get the feeling that this has been
We're duly impressed.
cluttering up my brain since
Yes.
the last 6 years. I mean, it's in there. It's ineradicable, taking up space from other things that I could know, and it's of no use whatsoever. It's not as if I find a word in a sentence, and I say, I wonder if it's a preposition. Let me consult my list. I mean, I would never do that. English doesn't work that way. So it just seems it's inert knowledge. It's knowledge that kind of by its nature could not do me any good. I don't want to stress the by its nature, because I'm imagining certain linguists might find value in being able to list the prepositions. And certainly there's value in trigonometry and algebra. And I've used both of them. But a good deal of what we learn in school is inert knowledge. And I can also say it could be inert knowledge for various reasons. That is, it could have a very great use, but I just never happened to have a chance to use it in that way, right? I might learn accounting principles, but have no relationship to accounting whatsoever. So it's not the fault of the content all the time, or maybe even very often. It can be the fault of or the result of many other circumstances in life. But yeah, so those are some examples I have, and Trivial Pursuit is a good example of inert knowledge, right? Playing Trivial Pursuit, where you have this arcane set of facts, or you could win on quiz shows. But if you happen not to have been called to a quiz show, you'll never get to use knowledge.
You'll never win that $1 million.
Yeah.
Those are good examples. And I want to remind us that the way that these distinctions are labeled, we have inert information versus activated ignorance and activated knowledge, or inert information versus activated knowledge. So in terms of inert information, the idea is that we don't really have, you were broaching that, right? We have the information that in some cases, the information could actually be useful, but we don't actually use it. So that's one form of inert information. So it doesn't become knowledge for us because we don't know it deeply, and therefore, because to know something is to act upon it, is the idea. If you really have the knowledge, it's like when people say, I know that I shouldn't smoke, but I smoke anyway. You don't really know that you shouldn't smoke.
Yeah.
To know it is to act upon it.
Yeah, at least to accept it deeply so that it affects your behavior in some major way. That's right. It's yeah, you can kind of,
even if it's just causing cognitive dissonance.
Right. Yeah.
It's got to do something. It's got to make you feel uncomfortable.
Well, yeah, you can kind of, there's a way in which I think you can kind of know something with one part of your brain or one part of your mind, and you just never let it connect to other parts of your mind, like the ones about actually smoking or not. And it can sit in there kind of as a fact. Yes, cigarette smoking causes cancer. And so I think you're right that it doesn't count as knowledge.
Well, this is one of the points that Richard brings up in his original anthology. And I hope that people understand the importance of this work, the seminal work that was really being developed in the early 1980s. And he, in one of the chapters, Richard focuses on Bloom's taxonomy. And in this article, Bloom's taxonomy and critical thinking instruction, recall is not knowledge. He's making the point that to know something is to act upon it. To know something is to have it move you,
Mhm.
And otherwise, uh, it's a watered down version of knowledge. And then what is that? You see? So I know it, but I don't act upon it.
Right.
I know it, but I don't what? Believe it. You see?
Yeah.
So it's a very important discussion
Yeah.
to have so that we're faced with that. So if I say that I know something, then I need to be willing to act upon that. I think that's the move
Right.
I have to
Yeah.
hold myself to.
And I like you're bringing in dissonance or cognitive dissonance so that at a bare minimum, if I know something that is disturbing, it ought to cause me some tension inside. I mean, that's a minimal amount to make it into knowledge. It may not make it all the way into my actual behavior, but as a step in that direction, it at least causes me tension or to feel dissonance. And if it doesn't do even that much, then there's a sense in which it's not that idea isn't in me at all. What I have instead of the idea is the words for the idea. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that I've always thought that the concept of cognitive dissonance is very powerful
Mm,
because it represents the tension,
mhm,
you could say, between, in many, if not most cases, the rational and the irrational. But
mhm.
there's also tension between the tension that you feel, let's say, when you're facing a true dilemma.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So but usually when I think of cognitive dissonance, I think there's some self-deception involved,
Right.
and there's something I'm not willing to face
Right.
about my situation or myself.
Yeah.
And just having that realization that there is that tension,
Right.
for me is very important because I may not act upon it as soon as I should,
Hmm.
but usually I do act upon it in the end.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
when I do, then I wish I had done so sooner, usually.
Right. And just as a side issue about cognitive dissonance for a moment, I think in the purest cases that say Festinger investigated, first of all, it's it's kind of completely unconscious, meaning the dissonance there is not a felt dissonance at all. It's that I see somebody begging for money, and I have this belief in myself that I help people who are in need, and I don't give this person any money, so I walk away. And then afterwards, how do I reconcile those two, that activity, that action, and that belief that I'm really a good person who gives money to those who are in need? And I say, well, he's probably drinking, he's probably using drugs, and so I get rid of the dissonance of those two beliefs. But much of the time, like a lot of our irrationality and the egocentricity and sociocentricity, it's operating in us unconsciously, and it takes work to bring it to the surface.
Well, of course, we are reminded that whenever we are deceiving ourselves, there's some unconscious parts of our thinking. But just looking at a quick definition online right now, the term cognitive dissonance is used to describe the mental discomfort that results from holding two conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes. So I think that this concept has been expanded, and in any case, I think of that mental discomfort piece of it. To me, that's the powerful part of the term. And so you see, typically we figure out, you see, the example that you gave to me is an example of someone who doesn't really feel cognitive dissonance. They actually just justify it in their minds. You see, if there's not some kind of tension,
Right.
then which is, I think, what normally happens. In other words, without cognitive dissonance, without that mental discomfort, it's very easy to be selfish. Right. It's very easy to ignore the needs of others.
Right. So I think that's not the classical definition of cognitive dissonance. That is, I think the classical definition emphasizes cognitive, not emotive dissonance, not a feeling of tension. It's, I have two beliefs. I'm a good person, and this person is in need, and three beliefs, and I don't give them any money. So those are three cognitive beliefs, and I reconcile them. I get rid of that cognitive dissonance by rejecting one. And the one I can reject is that person is in need. He's not really in need. He's going to use it for drugs. So I think that's a later rendition of cognitive dissonance, and it speaks to something really important. But I think it's different from what the original cognitive dissonance theory was intending to address. That's Ahrens, Gerald, Festinger, and those people. But
well, I think we should leave that.
Yeah, me too.
Focus on the power in that that tension, and then back to inert information to sort of wrap that up. So the idea, so we talked about the type of inert information that could be powerful, but we're not acting upon it. Right. So for example, we know that we need to do certain things to help the health of the planet. Right. Are we acting upon that? So we may have a lot of information about it, but are we doing anything with it? So there's this whole positive arena of information that's we could be acting on that we're not acting on. And then there is also information that we're carrying around of the other type that you were mentioning, which is just, like the prototypical way that I think about this is the way we used to teach history, and still sometimes done, is teaching just dates and places and names. Right. Remember that's been the history of traditional history of traditional schooling.
It is.
And
yeah.
The idea that you can cram this into the student for use later. You mentioned that as well, but I wanted to just circle back upon that because that is very important. And it's not only true that we cram a lot of things into the head of the students that they can't use, but then while doing that, we're also misteaching what learning entails. And we're wasting their time. So we're doing all of those things at once. So they're not learning anything of value in this case that I'm giving. Their time is being wasted, and they're mislearning what it means to learn. So that's a lot in one huge mistake.
Right.
So by the way, that leads to maybe the next move we can make is to talk about then activated ignorance, because that's an example of activated ignorance.
It is. Right.
The idea that you can teach in that way and this will work, and that students will learn something of value or much of value, not just something of value, because they need to learn in accordance with the time that they're giving to the learning. And so in other words, we have to teach a lot because we have a lot of time, but we're teaching very little. So a lot of our traditional educational theories that have come down to us are based in activated ignorance.
That's right. That's right. That's a very nice insight, Linda. That just seems right to me. Yeah. There's a joke I sometimes say at workshops about instructors who lecture, and you kind of have to listen all the way to the end of the joke. So it's that teachers who say, I've told them 100 times and they still don't get it, are slow learners. That is, once you've told them 99 times and they haven't gotten it, why would you tell them one more time to make it even?
Yes.
Right. And so it's a good example of, it seems to me, of activated ignorance in that, right, you just, the whole theory, the whole idea, all the information you have is all incorrect about telling them as a way of making it work for them. Yeah. Yes.
Yes. So then, so therefore, people come out of schools, colleges, and universities without having the knowledge to continue learning as, let's say, a scholar would continue learning, and as scholars do learn within their fields.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So the way in which scholars approach their fields are the way that we should also approach our minds, because we want to continue to develop our minds, not just in one area, but in all the important parts.
Right. And you see it often in the way learning manifests itself later, because a lot of what we're going to learn in school has got to be generalized for it to take effect. So if you're in an area where you deal with helping people, medicine or nursing or social work or a whole range of things where you're involved in helping people, what you've learned in school to prepare you for that are things like pretty good generalizations, pretty good rules of thumb about how you deal with those situations, but you now have to approach it as if that knowledge that you have is really got a lot of ignorance in it about specific cases. Here, and it can be among very sophisticated people. I had a pinched nerve in my neck last year, and I was taking a lot of naproxen, and you're supposed to only take one every 12 hours, but the prescription dose is 3 twice a day. And I was taking massively more than that. And I've done that for pains and arthritis and things like that for years and years and years. So I went to this doctor and to this physical therapist, and he's very good. And I told him, I'm taking too much naproxen, and he said, well, you've got to stop doing that. And I told him how much, and he kind of gasped, and he said, that you're harming yourself by doing that. And I said, well, I just had the blood tests downstairs and they're fine, right? I mean, I was just tested this last week, and you've got the results in front of you. And he said, yeah, but you're poisoning yourself. It really does damage to you. And I said, well, I think you're paying a lot of attention to the data, but not to the evidence. I'm 75 years old, and I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've just had blood tests. So all the evidence points to it's not harming me. The data shows that there's a curve of harm that gets done. And clearly, I'm on one end of that curve, the wrong end of that curve. So the generalization doesn't quite apply to me. So my judgment is, he would fine with that, but my judgment is that he's paying attention to the statistical case, which I want him to do, which is quite relevant, but he also needs to see how the ignorance that's involved in where this individual falls in that statistical case. Right? We do that all the time. I mean, you often emphasize outliers, for instance, how important those are. Right?
I was just thinking of that, right? So that's the outliers we usually ignore when we talk about data. And so the outliers bother us because we just want everything to be simple.
Right.
And so that's part of activated ignorance.
Yeah. And there's a way in which teaching, I don't want to say you have to, but teaching strongly lends itself to that, because you're wanting to prepare people for a whole range of things, and you can't teach all the specifics in a classroom of 30 students. But it would help to emphasize how you need to have, I'll say, activated knowledge about your individual patient or your individual client, in addition to the generalization based on the data or the statistical distribution. Yeah.
So we're focusing, as a reminder to all of us, we're focusing on information here. So we're thinking about information moving to, again, moving from inert information to activated ignorance. So we're focusing on examples of information that lead us to do things that do not make sense in the context, that can cause harm, that can lead us in the wrong direction. And there are just so many examples. We can think of, for example, the misinformation that is occurring across the world with the internet. And that is a new phenomenon in human history, relatively new, that we can so easily spread misinformation. We've always had it, of course, but the spreading of it and the propagating of it by, for example, countries, by politicians, by political groups, this, and the fact that people will believe more or less anything. And when you add the sociocentric dimension to it, right, so that people are believing because other people believe. So people will often say, well, you know, there are lots of people on Facebook talking about this. Well, so people on Facebook talking about something does not prove that it's worthy of your consideration.
Yeah, and doesn't even give evidence for it. I mean, it's just not even that it doesn't go all the way toward proving it, but it's not evidence at all that people are talking about it. Yeah.
And it's also what happens with gang behavior. It's the same kind of thing, just going along with the crowd. So then we have, as a result of misinformation, we have what is now referred to as the January 6th insurrection in the United States, when our Capitol was breached by the people who were disgruntled, and people were killed and people are harmed now. There's a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder on the part of the police. Many of the police have not recovered from this. And these are consequences of activated ignorance. And I'm sure many of the people who entered the Capitol on that day regret it.
Right.
Realize now
that
they were led astray. And there are people who are saying that. I was led astray. I was told information that wasn't true and I believed it. And so then this leads to the fact that when you are a vulnerable person intellectually, you can be led in many wrong directions. And many of these people were professionals, many of the military people. And so it's good to find that that's actually and unfortunately, it's a very good example of misinformation leading to great harm. And then you have another current example, which is the war that is occurring right now where Russia is in Ukraine, and all of the people being killed there. And I don't want to talk about events leading up to that event because it's very complicated. That part I want to set aside for a moment. What I'm talking about here is the slaughtering of innocent people by the soldiers and the horrifying things that are being done in 2022. It's unbelievable that you can see this kind of torture and suffering that we're seeing, just the attacking of innocent people on buses and things like this. Now, what would lead such a person to do such a thing? That's when you answer that, you will have an example of activated ignorance.
Yeah.
And of course, it is propaganda, it is misinformation, and on the part of the government toward the soldiers. It's easy to whip up your soldiers in a country, in any country, and especially in a country like Russia. So then you have massive suffering, and this is just one example of a war that's going on here, and there are many other examples.
Right. And let me bring up what a theoretical point, a point related to theory, but it is exemplified in everything we've been, in all the actual examples we've just been given. And it's that when we talk about activated ignorance, and that is acting on the basis of information that's incorrect, inaccurate, what we're always presupposing, I think, is that the information is A, inaccurate, and B, we have some way of accessing the inaccuracy of that information. That is, if it's information that no one knows,
Mm-hmm.
that's not the same as activated ignorance, right? And so when Columbus thought China was only 5,000 miles to the east, to the west, that was just kind of generally believed, figured out on the basis of globes and everything like that. That's not activated ignorance, though he was doing the best he could with the amount of knowledge there was in the world, and there was no way to access the largeness of the globe. And there are abundant examples of that. Activated ignorance, I think, comes from a place like the Ukraine example you just gave. I have full knowledge. If I'm a Russian soldier, I have full knowledge that these are human beings who are innocent human beings. And that information is obtainable by me in a direct and straightforward way. And so that seems to me to be what's going on with activated ignorance. Similarly,
Right, that's a good point. Mm-hmm.
Similar with the teaching examples, it's very straightforward that teaching history as names, dates, kings, queens, and so forth is not the same as learning history, and it's not useful and it's not meaningful to most students at all. It's as if that stares me in the face, and
Mm-hmm.
then I don't act. That's activated ignorance. So I think that's an important distinction to make.
That is very that is very powerful. So the information, the accurate information, is available. We could,
Right.
it's known to someone,
Mm-hmm.
and it may not be known. You see, if you grow up in an area, let's say, where you're taught to be prejudiced against people because of their skin color,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the way everyone around you thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just say you've never been exposed to anything else. You have no other way of knowing anything, because that's all the things that the thing that you've ever been taught. That's what you've always been taught.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to think of an example where you never had access to the knowledge, and you were overwhelmingly pulled into this other very negative way of thinking from a child. You see, I'm trying to give it, kind of a paradigm case of how a person might do the right thing if given access to the knowledge, but because they're raised in where there's so much ignorance prevailing,
Right.
that they are pulled in this other direction. It's a difficult thing, because then also you brought up the soldiers. You said the soldiers know that this is a person that is a feeling person, and they have access to that knowledge. Yeah. But that raises, for me, the question of ethics, or the concept of ethics, which is a later discussion. But ethics is something, you see, we're not really taught in human societies. We're taught ethics couched within, let's say, religion, or couched within some ideologies, but not in and of itself, except in narrow philosophical groups usually, right? So ethics is something we're not really even discussing. Mm-hmm. But the most fundamental understanding in ethics, in terms of how I should treat another person, as far as I understand ethics, is that I have because I am human, I have the capacity to understand that another person also has feelings and feels and has sensations. So that if I hurt that person, then I should be aware that that's not the right thing to do. You see how it's so basic, it's so simple. It's like, yeah, but how do you know that? Well, that's sort of the bottom to me. You don't get that, then you don't have the basis for ethics.
Well, there really, I think you're right. But there's this other factor that's relevant to what we're saying, and that is that the knowledge, the information that this is a full human being who's innocent, who hasn't done anything wrong, and who's going to suffer if I do X, Y, and Z to this person. That's inert. Now that's inert
Information.
Inert knowledge, inert information. Right. That is, it's not acting in me. So there's the ethical question, which is a big question, but there's also just the straightforward inert information that I've got staring me in the face, and I'm just not admitting it. I'm just not accepting that's so.
There's so many ways we can go with activated ignorance. So, for example, take all the dynamics that occurred in the 1960s and the 1970s, not just in the U.S. but across the world,
right?
And the quote revolutions, and then ask yourself, well, what was the result of that? Like what came out of that by implication and by consequence? And unfortunately, although there were some good things that did come out of the movement, unfortunately, as with most, if not all, so-called revolutions that have occurred in human history, what has been lacking is critical thinking. So there have been parts of critical thinking, but there has never been a rich concept of fair-minded critical thinking at the heart of these revolutions, and that's why they fail. So you have one great idea is not going to solve the problem. So the idea of the slogans that we use, that just say no to drugs, and those sorts of slogans, and so forth. So we can think that we are really making progress, but there can be something missing. And that missing is usually critical. That thing missing is usually critical thinking when you're talking about human problems, solving human problems.
Right.
So there is a lot there. Let me read a few examples, if I could, on just very quickly. So a few more examples on activated ignorance. And I'm reading now from my book entitled Liberating the Mind, just a few examples. Now, this is focusing on egocentric and sociocentric thinking, but some of these examples are helpful. So there is a doctor, Jerome Groopman, who's written a book entitled How Doctors Think. And he details problems in the medical profession as he understands them. And so I'm just going to read a few of the points that he makes in his book. So I'm summing up here. So he says, physicians tend to overly rely on classification schemes and algorithms when treating patients. And this, I want to read a little more of this because this relates a little bit to what you were saying about your medical example. Such an approach often fails to take into account the course of a specific person's disease and the individual characteristics of the patient, sometimes leading to dire consequences. So he says, scoring schemes are proliferating in all branches of medicine, and these schemes suit the hectic pace of today's clinical care. So that's just one example. So a doctor using schemes and algorithms when treating patients, and that's what your physical therapist was basically doing in the example that you gave.
I guess that's right. Yeah, that's right. All right.
And these others relate very quickly. Most of these are interrelated. Physicians often stick with traditional approaches to medical problems, even when such approaches are ineffective. Then number 3, doctors do not generally tend to focus on their mistakes.
Yeah.
So what's the activated ignorance there? I don't make mistakes. I'm perfect.
And yeah, I think I've told you before that I've sometimes worked with University of Arizona Medical School, and they have this program on medical ignorance. Well, and the first conference I attended, I gave some talk on critical thinking, but almost everybody there was a physician. And this panel of doctors got up on the stage and discussed what they did not know, which is a very unusual thing for doctors. And we in the audience went away terrified because they were talking not about what they don't know about obscure diseases of only a few people, but they were talking about breast cancer and prostate cancer. This is in the 90s, so it may be outdated information now. And this was the head of the AMA, the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, the head of Yale Medical School. So these were not just the doctors on the corner, these are the persons who specialize in it. And we found out that the people in the audience went away just kind of shaken more than, and the women said, well, I'm never going to have a mammogram again. They don't know what to do with the information. And the men said, I'm never going to have a prostate exam again. They don't know what to do with the information. Again, you can't vouch. I'm not vouching for the validity of this now. But that gets revealed by these doctors. Doctors are far more, in my experience, much more comfortable talking about what they do know rather than about what they do not know, much less the mistakes that they make. Yes.
And again, that's true in every field. So we don't want to be implying that it's only doctors. So we don't tend to see our professors starting out lectures with or discussions with, but first, let me tell you all the ways in which I was wrong the last time we met.
Oh, yeah.
Or let me tell you how I was wrong when I started studying this years ago. Or let me tell you when I was wrong anytime. Let me just tell you when I was wrong, because that we think of as a sign of weakness. So intellectual arrogance has been embraced in academia, and it's been embraced in the profession. So you don't say when you're wrong. And if you think about the way business is run on the business model focusing on making money, then we're not going to tell you our mistakes. We're only going to tell you, and we're going to not only tell you the good things that we do, but we're going to sometimes exaggerate that.
Right. Well, in that spirit, let me tell you a big mistake I made with relation to critical thinking and teaching, in that I taught my classes, and I was a philosophy professor. And so for several years, my students would turn in essay exams on ethics or in philosophy of science or something like that. And they would write these wonderful essays, really nice reasoning in them and everything. And they would get good grades and I'd get very positive evaluations. And it took me years, like 5 years, to realize that the good reasoning they were showing was my reasoning. That's the way I had explained to them. And so I tried giving them another question that we had not addressed in class specifically, but was like the question we addressed in class. And they were, not all of them, but most of them were no better at reasoning through this new question than they had been at the beginning of the course. In fact, they went back to their old ways of thinking. And that's how I got started in critical thinking. What can I do to help them reason things through? But I want you to hear, it took 5 years to register in me. So it's just a good example of inert information, in that I'm going to say it should have been apparent to me that this was not the student's own reasoning, but it wasn't apparent to me at all. So in the spirit of owning up to
That's a good example. Thank you for that, Gerald. I don't know if I'm going to share accordingly, but maybe I'll think of one for myself that would be parallel. But that's the kind of thing that we want to be comfortable with. We want to be comfortable saying, that was really a mistake, because this is this is directly connected with the development of intellectual virtues and having confidence in reason. So often having confidence in reason means that we have to admit that we've been wrong when we're faced with new reasoning. And sometimes that means admitting that you've been doing something sometimes all of your life.
Right. Yeah.
So in other words, you can say, well, I've been living all of these many years and I've been doing this wrong. And I have to be able to say, okay, then I'm changing right now. Not, well, I'm holding on to that then, which is what we tend to do. Then that, because that's connected to my identity. So this way of talking and thinking is really antithetical to almost all of schooling today, because we don't bring this intellectual humility into our classrooms.
Right.
Typically. So then just a few other quick examples. On the, still focusing on what Dr. Groupman says in his book, he says doctors often ignore information that contradicts a fixed way of diagnosing or treating patients. So that's related to the other points. And then there's another example I want to mention. It's a case of Barry Marshall, an Australian doctor who in 1981 traced both ulcers and stomach cancer to a gut infection. And at that time, we thought that ulcers were caused by stress. This suggested that both might be treatable by antibiotics. For many years, mainstream gastroenterologists dismissed his theory, holding fast to the established view that ulcers were caused by stress. Marshall, who presented his views to the annual meeting of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, said, to gastroenterologists, the concept of a germ causing ulcers was like saying that the earth is flat. They were using the old model, basing their thinking on basically ignorance. Marshall tried to get funding for his work from pharmaceutical companies, all of which initially refused him. This is not surprising given that these companies were making billions of dollars a year selling Zantac and Tagamet to treat ulcers as consequences of stress. So this brings in the motivating part of activated ignorance. So I'm motivated to not know that information if I'm a pharmaceutical company, because we're not willing to give up these billions of dollars. And so what Marshall did is he infected himself. Finally, after years of trying to get people to listen, he infected himself with the ulcer-causing bacteria obtained from one of his patients who had an ulcer to prove the cause of the ulcers, and then treated himself with the antibiotics to prove the cure, and it worked. So this is an example of activated ignorance. And one other final example from this book I want to mention. In 1974, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its official list of mental disorders in 1974. This reclassification came about as a result of a poll taking of the association's general membership. And psychiatrist Lee Coleman describes the manner in which the official list changed. What particularly struck many observers was the obviously political rather than scientific basis for the change. Under growing pressure from the homosexual community, the trustees of the APA declared by a majority vote in December 1973 homosexuality to be no longer a mental disorder. So much controversy resulted from this that a referendum was called to enable the entire APA membership to vote. Of the total votes cast, 5,854 called for elimination, 3,810 for retention, and 367 abstained. What he's pointing out is that they voted on this concept rather than taking into account the scientific information about it.
Mhm.
And this is another example of all of activated ignorance causing so much pain and suffering. So we can be reminded of the way many homosexuals were treated with shock treatment and horrifying procedures that they went through to cause them to regurgitate while watching it. This awful things that we did to these people, because the idea was that they were freaks and they had to be changed. And so there you are. That's another example. And it just goes on and on. So let's move on to our last concept, if we could, unless you want to say anything else about activated ignorance.
Yeah, I wanted to add one piece, and that is the people at University of Arizona Medical School that I told you about have told me that many doctors still mention stress for ulcers. And they say, well, of course, it's caused by a bacteria, but stress also plays an important role. And notice it's a way of kind of retaining it while rejecting it at the same time. I don't want to be picking on doctors because, as you said, this obtains in all areas, but it's kind of striking that even when we find out, we still can have remnants of that belief which stay in us.
That's a good example, because I actually heard that recently.
Really?
And so before this discussion, I looked this up again to make sure that this was still correct. And there's nothing there on stress causing ulcers.
Right.
So, but stress can cause so many things. It's a fallback, right? So that's an easy move. Well, it's stress is causing it.
Yeah. Though it's made me in the past occasionally doubt the universality of what stress causes. It's made me think maybe many of these other things that are allegedly caused by stress are caused by something else.
Yes.
Maybe bacterium, but something else. Yeah.
So true. And so we know that stress plays a role in our lives, but what is that role?
Right.
And I think the best way to figure that out is to try to be aware of when you're under stress and how you're handling it. Again, it goes back to thinking and critical thinking. So there's a lot to be said about activated ignorance. We could go on and on, but we get a lot of messages as we go through life from groups, from parents, from teachers, from the societies in which we live, that lead us to behave in ways that cause problems for ourselves and others. And we in talking about schools, for example, we haven't even mentioned all of the bad things that students learn about like the bad habits that they leave our schools with based on just the social interactions that they've had, that have not been guided, that have not been disciplined in a critical thinking sense.
Yeah.
So we're getting ignorance from many angles as humans.
Right.
And this gets in the way of our ability to achieve our own capacities. So let's move to activated ignorance. And now activated ignorance, again,
knowledge, you mean?
I'm sorry, yeah, activated knowledge. So let's move to activated knowledge. So activated knowledge means that we are using information in our thinking that is accurate, and we're acting upon that information, and it is helpful, useful, powerful in a given set of circumstances.
Yeah.
Now, I would like to just read, if I could, as an opener here, from John Henry Newman in 1851. In 1851, John Henry Newman wrote his famous set of lectures, Discourses on the Scope and Nature of university education, which in 1852 became the idea of a university. So for those of you who are interested in following up on this discussion, you can get the book entitled The Idea of a University, and you're going to see one section focusing on education and one section focusing on religion. So we're focusing on the education side here. So this is, John Henry Newman wrote very eloquently about the concept of education. So let me read a little of his writing, read a little of this to you. Truth of whatever kind is the proper object of the intellect. So that directly relates to activated knowledge. Mm-hmm. Its cultivation then lies in fitting it to apprehend and contemplate truth. The intellect in its present state does not discern truth intuitively or as a whole. We know not by direct and simple vision, not at a glance, but as it were by piecemeal and accumulation, by a mental process, by going round an object, by the comparison, the combination, the mutual correction, the continual adaptation of many partial notions, by the employment, concentration, and joint action of many faculties and exercises of mind.
I'm smiling because that's one sentence in addition to so.
I know. So you see, if you stopped with by piecemeal, then teachers could say, well, that's what we're doing.
Oh, right.
Piecemeal.
Right.
But you have to go further. You can't just stop there. And accumulation by a mental process. And then again, all of these things that he's saying, interrelated. So activated knowledge to me is not a like one idea or one piece of information that I know. Like, but it could be, I know that I shouldn't smoke, so I don't smoke, as the example, switching, turning over the example we were using before. But actually, activated knowledge is much more complicated than that, because it means that we have a web of understandings that are based in truth, and that we've worked into our thinking over time. So, for example, the theory of critical thinking represents, if used effectively, activated knowledge. And the theory of critical thinking is interconnected. It's not one sentence. It's not one principle. So anyway, this is a way in as we think about activated knowledge. Let me just read a little more. Such a union and concert of the intellectual powers, such an enlargement and development, such a comprehensiveness is necessarily a matter of training. And again, such a training is a matter of rule. It is not mere application, however exemplary, which introduces the mind to truth, nor the reading of many books, nor the getting up of many subjects, nor the witnessing many experiments, nor attending many lectures. All this is short of enough. A man may have done it all, yet be lingering in the vestibule of knowledge. He may not realize what his mouth utters. He may not see what his mental eye, with his mental eye, what confronts him. He may have no grasp of things as they are, or at least he may have no power at all of advancing one step forward of himself in consequence of what he has already acquired. No power of discriminating between truth and falsehood, of sifting out the grains of truth from the mass, of arranging things according to their real value. Such a power is an acquired faculty of judgment, of clear-sightedness, of wisdom, and of intellectual self-possession and repose. The eye of the mind, of which the object is truth, is the work of discipline and habit. Now, I can go on and on reading in John Henry Newman, and I will pull up multiple paragraphs that are going to be coming at the same point from different eloquent positions.
Right, right.
So you see, if people who, if people just could understand this, then they would realize a lot. They would see the intellectual virtues are embedded in this. And we could talk about how, this relates to the theory of critical thinking. So activated knowledge presupposes that we think about knowledge in a deep sense, and that we take knowledge seriously. And it's also, of course, directly, again, as I've said, related to intellectual humility. So, and remember the professor who came to the conference years ago, who started out his keynote address by making us say, it was Ed Damer, I'm probably wrong. So he said he had students at the beginning of his class every semester, before they did anything else, he said, I want you to all repeat after me. I'm probably wrong. Remember, he had everybody in the audience repeating after him. I'm probably wrong. Before you know it, we were all, I'm probably wrong. I'm probably wrong. I'm probably wrong. Right. And so that's at the heart of this. Now, Richard corrected that and said, I may be wrong. So, but Ed was saying, no, you've got to get a little further out there, because you didn't say your ego, but right. So I get the point that if I start with saying, I'm probably wrong here, I'm probably missing something here, I likely don't know everything here. Start out there. If we start out there, then we can think at a much higher level.
Well, let me address a different aspect. I said last time, I'm a little embarrassed about it, that information was my least favorite of the elements of reasoning, or the one I found least interesting. And I'm going to say, in something of the same spirit, but still with embarrassment, that I have the same reaction to one of the standards, and that is accuracy. I, of course, realize that accuracy is absolutely essential. Of course, I realize that. But my judgment is that teachers, for instance, who teach didactically, just lecture and lecture, or just give out facts and facts, the one standard that they're attuned to is accuracy. That is giving out accurate information. If they give you all these dates from history, they're accurate dates. And activated knowledge is acting in such a way that it's based on accurate information. Okay, and the based on is very, very important, and that brings in all the other standards, or most of the other standards. To say I act based on the information means, and you said it also. You said it's we have the information and we use it for something useful and helpful. Well, that means it's relevant. It's directly relevant to that situation, and it's significant, meaning it's important. So it's not just a trivial piece, and it's precise enough. So one of the things that the physical therapist I mentioned didn't do was he wasn't precise about applying the statistical information to this individual patient. And so all those other standards come in, and often we're kind of not aware of those, because the concept of accuracy, or truth for that matter, sweeps things under the rug. So I'm fully confident that John Henry Newman meant not just truth, but relevant truth, deep truth.
Of course, right. And you can see that implied, right, in his words.
When Bertrand Russell says we need to follow the facts in his peculiar wavery tone of voice, he doesn't just mean facts. He means facts that are relevant to this situation, that are sufficiently precise on all the other standards. And so that fills out activated knowledge for me in a way that accuracy doesn't quite capture by itself. Does that make sense to you?
Well, yeah, I do understand what you're saying, and I do think it's something that we have to think about. And that you can be stating information that is accurate, but it may not be useful. And that's why I think to me, a powerful term in this is the term activate. So you don't just have accurate information, you're using it.
Right.
You're acting upon it.
Yeah, right.
And that's what many people lack the developed ability to do.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we have the capacity to act upon knowledge that we have, but do we act upon it?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if I want to, let's say, I'm just wanting to do something interesting that's different, and I decide, well, I'll just try art. Why not? I'll just try it.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say that in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, you're not an artist. You can't do that. You can't do art. You've never done that. Look how old you are. You can't start something like that now. Mm-hmm. So that's the voice that basically is holding us back.
Right.
Whereas the other voice was not saying, I want to be brilliant. I want to be great. I want to be the best in the world. I want everyone to, bow down to me. It just means I want to see if I can try it.
Right.
So let's say I'm such a person. I say, well, why don't I just try it? I'm able to, do some things. I've done this and I've done that, and why not try it? And if it doesn't work out, well, I tried it. The idea of just trying something, that if you try, that you'll get better. You may not achieve your goal, but very frequently you will achieve your goal. Mm-hmm. And very frequently you will achieve it when it looked like there was no way that you could achieve it. Mm-hmm. And so let's say, and you can see this in a lot of, for example, writers, some very good writers who never did actually believe in themselves.
Right. So
George Orwell is such a person. So he never believed that he could achieve while he was achieving. Mm-hmm. And so that was not true, that he couldn't achieve.
Right.
So when you have a certain level of capacity that is developed, you need to recognize that and acknowledge it. And you don't have to, salute it and bow down to it, but just say, I've had these successes. So that means when I start this next book, I have a good chance of achieving. Maybe I've written the one that everyone will remember me by. And that's all right. Because as Albert Ellis says, forget about writing the great American novel. It's already been written. Just do what you are capable of doing, and do that as well as you can. And don't worry about anything, else that might pull you back from that. So that's one example of activated knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's a very powerful, and it has to do with the way we think about ourselves, the principles upon which we live, and whether we live in accordance with the way other people think we should live, or in the way that we think that we should live at our highest level. And by the way, that's related, if I could, to just a very couple of lines from Letters from a Stoic, Seneca. He says, here is another saying of Epicurus. It's interesting. He was not, Seneca was a Stoic, but he often quotes from Epicurus. Because he says, well, people say bad things about what Epicurus says, but actually he makes some good points. And he says, here's another saying of Epicurus: if you shape your life according to nature, you will never be poor. If according to people's opinions, you will never be rich. See how simple that is. Nature's wants are small, while those of opinion are limitless. So you see that, we've heard that in many other ways, but that's just one, that's another example. So let's say I'm a person who is just chasing after money. and I realize that I'm not happy.
Mhm.
And so I read this. So somebody says, you know, you really need to read Seneca. So I remember how to read, and I sit down and I read this, and then I'm moved by it.
Right.
And that does happen.
Right. Yeah.
That's at the root of this
And
thing called critical thinking.
yeah, I remember the old, I guess, joke, or I don't know, about probably the money figure is outdated, but how much money is enough?
Mm-hmm.
Answer is $20,000 a year more than I make now.
Mm-hmm.
That is, whatever you make, you need this increment.
Yes.
Right. So maybe the number is off, but it speaks to that limitless quality of opinion. Yeah.
Well, going deeper with money,
Mhm.
or thinking more about that, you see, we don't tend in human societies to think about how much we're affected by money.
Right.
That
Yeah.
how much it permeates our thinking,
Right.
no
Right.
matter what your level of income.
Mhm.
This is part of what you're saying. In other words, we don't realize how much, if we take human societies and we overlay money
Mhm.
and the role that many roles that money plays in our lives.
Mhm.
If we just study that, and people do, but we all need to do more of that, not just scholars.
Mhm.
So scholars study this, and of course, Marxian scholars have been studying this for many years, and there are others that do, but all of us need to recognize how money is affecting us.
Right.
And that's activated knowledge.
Yes, it is. Right. Yeah.
And anything else that is permeating our lives. So if I'm being influenced by someone in my family negatively,
Mhm.
then I need to know that.
Mhm.
And I need to act upon that if possible. Maybe that means to remove myself.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so taking information that we know to be true seriously is what I'm getting at here.
Indeed, yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And not hiding from it. So that's just another type of activated knowledge. This, I'll just very brief reading from Eric Fromm. I'm reading from Man for Himself, an inquiry into the psychology of ethics. And I've just opened this up to something I underlined some time ago. Now in this section, he's talking about love. And if those of you who are scholars of Fromm will know that he wrote a book entitled The Art of Loving, which is going beyond this, but he's giving a little bit of his thinking here. To love a person productively implies to care and to feel responsible for his life, not only for his physical existence, but for the growth and development of all his human powers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's, if we were to adopt that sort of concept of love, and we were to actually love our neighbors, then there would be no war. To love productively, he says, is incompatible with being passive. So that's related to the opposite of being activated knowledge, of the opposite of active. To love productively is incompatible with being passive, with being an onlooker at the loved person's life. It implies labor and care and the responsibility for his growth. To love one person productively means to be related to his human core, to him as representing mankind. That's an interesting move, isn't it? All men are in need of help and depend on one another. Human solidarity is the necessary condition for the unfolding of any one individual. We don't really talk about human solidarity in our cultures. We talk about national solidarity.
Yeah.
But human solidarity, and then we should bring in sentient creatures to that.
Right. Yeah.
So these are examples of activated knowledge, and we again could just go on with many examples. But do you want to comment any further on activated knowledge or anything else that we've been discussing?
Yeah, in a way, I would just like to emphasize and partly reiterate something that you were saying, in that we've talked about inert information, activated ignorance, and activated knowledge. And but there is something else having to do with information, and it's kind of acting with a full knowledge of what it is I don't know, or a full awareness of what it is I don't know. And how deeply that goes in us, how many mistakes I could be making at this very moment, and just these gaps in my knowledge that I'm only partly aware of, or dimly aware of, or aware of, but I've shunted off to the side. And you can almost call it activated intellectual humility, to go along with the other three categories and put it into activated. And there's a way in which Ed Damer's statement, I'm probably wrong. I thought it was brilliant when he did it, but it doesn't quite capture it for me, because I would like there to be a preliminary statement ahead of time. I believe X, Y, and Z fully, but I may be wrong.
Yes, yes. You wanted that caveat the way that Richard did. Yes, no, I see that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Now, I do think there are other ways to think about these concepts, of course. But I think of the example that you gave as activated knowledge. In other words, if I realize that I often err,
right.
and I have limited knowledge in any particular area, no matter how much knowledge I have, and if I act upon that, then every time I come into a discussion, and I'm embodying intellectual empathy, to the degree that any of us can or do, because we're not perfect, then that would be an example of activated knowledge to me. But I do see, and it's important to weave together these these concepts, weave in and out of them, and interconnect them where it makes sense to. So, and I think for me to just wrap this up in terms of activated knowledge, I think it's important to circle back to teaching and learning. If we are teaching with a robust conception of fair-minded critical thinking, then we will teach the tools as well as we can to students, who will then act upon those tools, including the intellectual virtues. So if we place, let's just say, intellectual virtues at the heart of teaching and learning, and we have students acting upon their intellectual humility, acting upon their intellectual courage, acting upon their intellectual integrity, acting upon intellectual perseverance, act upon those, then we have a powerful set of tools for guiding instruction of any type. Right. And that's, it's unfortunate that we're not yet able to embrace that across human societies. But we do have the tools.
Yeah, the activation is built into the virtues, to the traits of mind.
Yes.
It's not, and that's what distinguishes it. It's one of the things that distinguishes them from skills. Intellectual perseverance is not an ability. It's not the ability to stick with an intellectual task all the way through. It's sticking with an intellectual task all the way through.
Yes, actually doing it.
Yeah, actually doing it. Yeah. So it goes back to Newman's point about it's not passive. Yeah. And yeah.
Well, I think that we have at least a beginning place for thinking about inert information, activated ignorance, and activated knowledge. Hopefully those who are with us in this session will be able to come up with their own examples, because we were just trying to give an idea of how these could be applied and how information connects with those. So I'll say goodbye to you for now, Gerald. Thank you to you and to everyone who's joined us.
Bye, Linda, and bye, everyone. Yeah.
Take care. We'll see you next time.